In the lining of a wool coat, something no bigger than a coin is about to decide whether a man lives or dies tonight. It is not a weapon, it is not a map, it is a button. Small, dull, ordinary, the kind of thing a tailor sews on without a second thought. And yet, picture a scene like this. In a farmhouse loft somewhere in occupied Belgium in the winter of 1943, an RAF navigator turns it counterclockwise between two frozen fingers, listening for a click that will tell him which way is north. Outside, dogs bark somewhere down the lane. The straw beneath him smells of dust and old rain. His breath fogs in front of his face, and his heart is loud enough that he is almost sure the farmer hiding him upstairs can hear it too. He has already burned his light papers. He has already buried his uniform jacket under a hedge 2 fields back. But he kept the coat. He kept the buttons, because someone, back at a briefing room in England, told him that one of them was not what it appeared to be. He does not know yet if it will work. He only knows that his life may depend on a piece of clothing hardware so unremarkable that no German soldier searching him would ever think twice about it. How did something so small become something that quiet, so dangerous, so trusted? To understand that, we have to go back a very long way. Long before uniforms, before wars, before the button even had a job to do at all. Nearly 4,000 years before that farmhouse in Belgium, in the river valley city of Mohenjo-Daro, in what is now Pakistan, someone carved a small curved shell into a disc and pierced it with 2 holes. Archaeologists date this object to roughly 2000 BCE, and it is often cited by some historians as among the earliest known button-like ornaments, though this dating and classification remain debated among archaeologists. But here's the detail that surprises most people. It was not used to fasten anything. There was no buttonhole for it to pass through. It was sewn on as decoration, a small gleam of shell-catching torchlight on someone's shoulder or chest, centuries before anyone thought to cut a slit in fabric and push it through. For thousands of years after that, this pattern repeated itself across the ancient world. Bronze Age graves in Europe have yielded button-shaped ornaments. Roman garments use clasps, pins, and brooches to hold fabric closed, not buttons. The button, in other words, existed as jewelry long before it existed as a tool. It sat on clothing, the way a brooch sits on a coat today, admired, not depended on. Which raises a strange question worth sitting with. If people had already invented this small, elegant shape, why did it take so long for anyone to realize what it could actually do? The answer arrives, according to costume historians, somewhere in Europe in the 13th century, and it changes the shape of the human body and cloth forever. Somewhere in Germany, in workshops we cannot name with certainty, someone finally paired the button with its missing half, a small reinforced slit cut into the opposite side of the fabric. Historians of dress, including scholars who have studied surviving garments from this period, generally place this innovation in the 1200s, spreading from German-speaking lands into France and beyond within a few generations. This sounds like a minor sewing detail. It was not. Before the buttonhole, clothing had to be loose enough to pull over the head, or held shut with pins, laces, or brooches that strained at the fabric. The buttonhole meant clothing could finally follow the curve of a shoulder, a wrist, a waist. Fitted, closed, precise. Tailors, a profession that barely existed before this point, suddenly had a reason to exist at all. You can hear the shift in the language of the period itself, according to some dress historians. Guild records from French and Italian cities in the 1300s begin listing button makers as a distinct trade, separate from tailors and goldsmiths, men who did nothing all day but shape small discs of bone, wood, horn, or metal. Picture one of those workshops on a cold morning in Bruges or Paris around the year 1350. The smell of tallow and hot metal, a boy sanding a bone disc smooth against a leather strap, an apprentice threading horsehair through 2 tiny holes to test the give of the thread. This was skilled, patient, unglamorous work. And it was about to become something else entirely, not a craft of function, but a language of power. Because once clothing could close tightly around the body, the button stopped being just a fastening. It became the first thing a stranger's eye landed on, and in a world obsessed with rank, that made it dangerous. By the 14th century, the button had become loud enough, socially speaking, that kings began legislating against it. In England, the statute concerning diet and apparel passed in 1363 under Edward III is one of the clearest surviving examples of what historians call Sumptuary Law, rules that dictated, by rank and income, what fabrics, furs, and trimmings a person was legally allowed to wear. Buttons of gold and silver were, in practice, reserved for the nobility and the wealthy merchant class. Laborers and servants were expected to make do with horn, bone, or thread-covered wood. This was not a symbolic suggestion. It carried real penalties. Records from English and continental courts of the period show fines and confiscations levied against commoners caught wearing ornamentation above their station, and buttons, being visible from across a room, were an easy thing to police. Historians still debate how rigorously these laws were enforced day to day in the busy, chaotic streets of a medieval town. But the intent is not in doubt. A row of gold buttons down a coat front was not fashion. It was a claim. It said, without a word being spoken, that the wearer answered to no one below the king himself. So why would anyone risk it? Because the same century that punished commoners for gold buttons was also producing merchants rich enough to buy their way past the rules, guildsmen wealthy enough to bribe an inspector, and younger sons of minor nobility desperate to look richer than their inheritance actually made them. The button had become a small, wearable form of ambition, and ambition, across every century since, has rarely obeyed the law quietly. What happens when an object built to close a coat becomes, instead, a way to lie about who you are? By the 17th century, that lie had become an art form, particularly at the courts of Europe, where the button reached a level of extravagance almost hard to picture today. Portraits from the French court under Louis XIV, held today in collections such as the Palace of Versailles, show courtiers in coats lined with rows of buttons in gold thread, enamel, and in the most extreme documented cases, set with precious stones, worn not to fasten anything useful, since many were purely decorative, but to announce wealth from across a ballroom. Surviving inventories from the period, cited by dress historians, described single sets of court buttons valued at sums that could have paid a servant's wages for years. This was the button at its most theatrical, heavy, glinting, useless in any practical sense, sewn in double and triple rows down coats that were themselves works of art. And it is worth pausing on the strangeness of this image. The same small object once made of a humble seashell in a Bronze Age river valley was now being carved from diamond by royal jewelers, for men who would never once in their entire lives do a day's manual labor in the clothes they wore it on. But courts are small, empires are large, and an object cannot become historically important, cannot end up saving a man's life in a Belgian farmhouse loft centuries later, by staying in the hands of kings. Somewhere, the button had to leave the palace and enter the pocket of everyone else. That shift happened not in Paris or Versailles, but in the smoke and hammer noise of an English industrial city that most people today do not associate with fashion at all. That city was Birmingham, and by the 18th century, an entire district of it had earned the nickname the Button Quarter. Streets of workshops turning out staggering quantities of buttons in brass, pewter, and plated metal for markets across Britain and its growing empire. At the center of this trade stood Matthew Boulton, whose Soho manufactory, whose construction began around 1761 to 62 and which became fully operational by the mid-1760s on the edge of the city, became one of the largest and most mechanized button and buckle works in Britain at that time, employing hundreds of workers under one roof using water-powered machinery decades before most of Britain had industrialized at all. Step into that factory in your mind, and the sensory world changes completely from a royal tailor's quiet workshop. Here there is the constant clatter of stamping presses, the hiss of steam, the smell of hot brass and machine oil, rows of workers, many of them women and children, as surviving employment records from Bolton's era confirm, feeding sheet metal into dies that punched out identical button blanks by the thousand. What had taken a craftsman an hour to carve by hand, a machine could now produce in seconds, and produce exactly the same, over and over, without variation. This changed who could own a button, and what a button meant. No longer a mark of nobility, it became something almost invisible in its ordinariness, sewn onto the coats of dockworkers, farmers, soldiers, and clerks by the tens of millions. And it is precisely here, in this new world of mass-produced, standardized, cheap little discs of metal, that the button quietly stepped into a role nobody in Versailles could have imagined for it, not decoration, but identification. By the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s, uniform buttons had become so standardized by regiment, by branch, by manufacturer, that they carry meaning long after the men who wore them are gone. Archaeologists and historians working sites such as the Gettysburg battlefield have used recovered uniform buttons, often the only metal object to survive a century and a half in the soil, to identify which regiments fought in a given field, sometimes down to a specific company. The National Park Service's own archaeological surveys of Civil War sites document this repeatedly. A corroded scrap of fabric may vanish entirely, but a brass button stamped with an eagle or regimental number endures. Think about what that means. A soldier falls in a field in Pennsylvania in July of 1863, and everything about him disintegrates over the following century and a half: his boots, his letters home, his face, his name in most cases. But the small disc of brass on his coat front does not disintegrate. It sits in the soil, patient, until someone with a trowel and a notebook finds it and reads, in a language of stamped eagles and regimental numbers, exactly which unit he belonged to. The button, in other words, had quietly become something the button makers of Bruges or the jewelers of Versailles never intended: a witness. A small, stubborn, corrosion-resistant record of who a person was, left behind long after everything else about them was gone. And that brings us, at last, back to that farmhouse loft in Belgium, and to the reason a young airman was turning a coat button between his fingers in the dark, instead of throwing it away with the rest of his uniform. Because in 1939 and into the early years of the Second World War, British intelligence, specifically a department known as MI9, tasked with helping captured or downed servicemen escape and evade capture, began working with an officer named Clayton Hutton to design escape aids that could pass a body search undetected. Hutton's team produced maps printed on silk that could be folded into a cigarette packet, hollowed out shaving brushes, and, most relevant to our story, buttons that were, in fact, tiny magnetic compasses. Surviving examples, held today in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London, show how it worked. The button unscrewed counterclockwise, revealing a small magnetized needle beneath luminous paint that would glow faintly in darkness, pointing north with enough accuracy to guide a man through unfamiliar countryside at night. Thousands of these compass buttons were issued to RAF aircrew before missions over occupied Europe, sewn onto standard issue coats in a way that made them indistinguishable, to the naked eye, from any other button on the garment. This is the turn worth sitting with. Everything we described earlier, the shelvisk worn for beauty in Mohenjo-Daro, the buttonhole that let tailors fit cloth to a body, the gold buttons that announced a king's favor, the brass buttons stamped identically by the thousand in a Birmingham factory, all of it had spent 4,000 years training the world to see the button as the least despiz object imaginable. Precisely because it had always been ordinary, decorative, forgettable, it became, in the hands of British intelligence in 1940, the perfect place to hide something that could save a life. The very ordinariness we've been describing this whole time was the disguise. So when that young navigator, cold and frightened in a Belgian loft, finally feels the click of the button releasing and sees the faint glow of the needle settling toward north, he is not benefiting from some sudden wartime invention. He is benefiting from 4,000 years of the world deciding a button was too small, too dull, too everyday to ever really look at twice. It is worth pausing here to ask why any of this should matter to us now, sitting comfortably, far from any battlefield or royal court. The truth is that we are still surrounded, every single day, by small objects we have trained ourselves not to look at closely: the button on a coat, the clasp on a bag, the plain metal disc on a pair of jeans. Designers today still exploit exactly the same principle Clayton Hutton did. Modern outdoor and tactical clothing brands sell buttons with hidden compasses, fire-starting flint, or tiny storage compartments, precisely because the button remains, psychologically, the most unnoticed piece of hardware on the human body. The next time you fasten your coat on a cold morning, you are repeating a gesture that has, at various points across history, meant fashion, meant rank, meant rebellion against the law, and meant, for one frightened man in 1943, the difference between capture and freedom. What we are left with, then, is a small tour through 4,000 years hiding inside a single, unremarkable disc of shell, bone, brass, or plastic. A decorative shell ornament in a Bronze Age river city with no practical use at all. A German innovation in the 1200s that finally gave clothing its shape. A royal decree in 1363 that tried, and largely failed, to keep gold buttons off the backs of ordinary people. A Birmingham factory floor in the 1760s that turned a mark of nobility into something every laborer could afford. A muddy battlefield in Pennsylvania where a corroded brass disc outlived the uniform, the body, and the name of the man who wore it. And a British workshop in the early 1940s that understood, better than anyone before, that the safest place to hide something precious was inside the one object no one had ever thought worth a second glance. Back in that Belgian farmhouse, the navigator closes his palm around the small brass disc, feels the faint groove where the needle has settled, and begins to move quietly toward the door, toward the tree line, toward whatever comes next in a war that button will help him survive. He does not think about Mohenjo-Daro or Matthew Bolton or the statute of 1363. He is only thinking about North. But the button in his hand carries all of it anyway, the way it always has, sewn onto shoulders and coats and uniforms for 4,000 years, saying nothing, revealing nothing, and quietly recording everything. So the next time your fingers close around a button without even looking, on a coat, a shirt cuff, an old jacket at the back of a closet, what do you think it has witnessed that it will never be able to tell you? And if an object this small can carry this much history sewn invisibly into it, what else on your body right now might be hiding a story you have never once stopped to ask about? Main sources for this story include the Imperial War Museum's archives on Mi-9 escape and evasion equipment, dress history research on medieval buttonhole origins, and the National Park Service's archaeological records from Civil War battlefield sites. The full list is in the description.